It's okay, no problem. We'll start again. Okay, no, we're not starting again. Sorry. Okay, fine. So the Gemara says, "Rav Yana Reish Lakish." Rav Yana Reish Lakish said 4 and 5, and Rav Yana Reish Lakish said 4 and 5, and the Brisa said 6. So that clearly is a contradiction. There you can't get away with the answer of saying until and not until, etc. So the Gemara says, "Lo kasha ad isay avu b'masa, how lo isa avu b'masa." The Gemara says something very interesting. The Gemara says when the Brisa, okay. When Resh Lakish and Rav Yana said 4 and 5, they were talking about a situation where the father is in town. Okay, and since the father is in town, then the age for when the child no longer needs the mother is 4 or 5, because the father, so to speak, steps in. But when there is no father present, okay, there's no father present, then the age that the child is going to be dependent on the mother is actually going to be an older age. Right? Interesting, right? You see what's going on? In other words, when there's going to be like, okay, dad is always going to be second. Okay, sorry, dads. Dad is always going to be second. But when the mother is around, then when the mother's around, mother's always going to be the main one, and therefore when the father and mother are around, then the child is going to need the mother until 4 or 5. But when there's a father then at 4 or 5, then okay, you can depend on the father. But when there's no father around, then the need for mom is going to be heightened when there's no father, and therefore it's only at a later age that the child is no longer going to have a need for the mother, right? Because when the father's around, then the child's able to check out, so to speak, because okay, the father to rely upon, even though the father's not the same, okay, but the father's able to step in and have some level of care. But when there's no father present whatsoever, then the age that the child no longer needs mom is going to be 6, and therefore there's no contradiction. Rav Yana and Rish Lakish said 4 and 5. That's when the father is around. The Brisa said until 6. That's when there is a father around. Okay, fascinating insight. We could probably have a whole share on that, but. Not today. Okay, says the Gemara further. Now the Gemara is going to talk about when a person is able to make an Eruv for the minor child. Until now, we were talking about a situation where you don't even have to make the Eruv for the child, meaning the mother makes an Eruv and the child is by definition included. Okay, that is one level, right? But now we're talking about past that level, there is going to be a situation where a parent is able to go. So let's say past the age of 4 or 5, or past the age of 6, depending on the circumstance. You do have to make an Eruv for the child, right? But normally, if I make an Eruv Tchumen for you, you have to be aware of it. You have to be cognizant of it. As we'll see, when it comes to a minor child or certain people, I can make an Eruv without your consent, without your knowledge, right? So at the lowest age, 4, 5, or 6, depends on the situation, there I make an Eruv, the mom makes an Eruv for the child, the mom makes an Eruv and the child is included, okay? But then you have an age when they're still a minor where you have to make an Eruv for them, but you don't need their consent, okay?
Make an Eruv, just say, put an extra piece of bread in.
Correct. You put the extra piece of bread in, and even though they're not meaning, but if I go ahead and I make an Eruv Tchumen for myself on this coming Shabbos, and I just put an extra piece of bread for you, it's meaningless. I can't do it without your consent, right? But when it comes to my minor child, I would be able to do so without their consent, and that's what the Gemara is going to get into right now. So, a person makes an Eruv for minor child, minor son, minor daughter, by just setting aside food, without necessarily telling them. The same would be true, or 82b2. The same would be true for a Kanani slave or a slave woman, bein l'daitan, bein shlo midaitan, both with their consent or without their consent. But you cannot make an Eruv for a Jewish servant or Jewish, male or female. You cannot make an Eruv on behalf of an adult son or daughter who's an adult. Nor for one's wife. All those latter cases has to be done with their consent. Okay, so basically minors and a Kanani slave or slave woman, there you could do it without their consent. But with an adult or with a spouse, there you need their consent. Tani idach, we have another brisa, who says something very similar. Lo ya'arev adam al yidei beno uvito hagdolim v'yidei avdo shchaso ivrim v'lo yidei ishto elami daiton. A person cannot make an Eruv Tchumen for an adult son, adult daughter, Jewish servant or maidservant, nor for a wife, except for with their consent. Okay, but you can make an Eruv for a Kanani slave woman, and for a minor son or a daughter with their consent or without their consent. Why? Now the Gemara explains why. The reason they are able to do so without their consent in those latter cases is because their hand is like your hand. In other words, what that means is that their financial jurisdiction is your financial jurisdiction. If a minor child picks up an item, there's a big discussion about who owns things. When a minor child owns something, is it really theirs, right? When you give a bar mitzvah gift to a 12-year-old boy, is it actually his? Okay, it actually belongs to the parent. I remember my grandmother like pulling me aside right before my mitzvah. She's like, okay, I gave you a gift already, but I don't really trust your father, her son. She says, she said it with love. She's like, here's another $100. This is for you. Make sure he doesn't get it. Okay, so halachically, does that work? Does that not work? Right. Bottom line is yado ki yado. That the yadan ki yado, that their hands really a minor was a minor at the time. That really it technically belongs to the parents. So in as much as the things that I own belong to my parents, it goes the other way as well. The parents goes ahead and can just set things up for them, and they don't have to agree whether it's good for them or bad for them, right? And again, Erev Tchumen is not intrinsically good, because if I set up an Erev Tchumen for that direction, then by definition, I can't go in that direction, right? So it's not, if I'm doing something which is purely good for you, I'm getting a gift for you, I don't need your consent. If I say, this phone now belongs to Tzvi, I don't need Tzvi's consent. It belongs to him, right? It's purely good. I mean, I guess some would disagree. It's a smartphone. Okay, you'll take it. You'll say it's pretty good. Okay, fine. But the point is that if it's a flip phone, it's purely good. Fine. But the bottom line is, but if it's something which is potentially detrimental, like Erev Tchumen, it would not be good. It would not be good. But since the child, yado ki yado, ki yadan ki yado, their hand is like his hands, therefore he's able to do something, the parent is able to do something against the child's will. Okay, yeah.
So this whole conversation is only about the walking Erev.
Correct.
Okay, sorry.
Right, because we saw the Mishnah last time, and we saw, right, and Rabbi Yehuda said, no, that's only true for Erev Tchumen, Erev Chatzeros, since it's a schos, since there is a benefit, there's only benefit to be able to carry in your courtyard, that's a different story, right? That's like the phone, because it's a pure benefit. Okay. Fine. Says the Gemara further. Let's say in a situation where, so in Solomon we've been talking about a situation where the master or the father sets up the Eruv and for the minor or for the slave, okay? But a situation where any of these people made their own Eruv to go in one direction and the master or the father made an Eruv to go in the opposite direction, right? New case. With similar people, the same characters, but different case. And so now we've been talking about, master goes ahead and sets up an Eruv for the servant, for the slave. It works. For the Hebrew servant, for the Jewish servant, it doesn't work. But now we're talking about a case where the non-Jew, where the Eved Kanani, right? Eved Kanani, by the way, has mitzvos, right? Eved Kanani has it has basic obligations to do mitzvos, not the exact same, but basic obligations. So let's say a scenario where the slave goes and puts an Eruv in this direction, master puts a slave in that direction. Whose Eruv wins in that case? So the answer is the one of their master, again, for that same reason, yadan ki yado, the one of their master is the one that trumps. That's the one that works. With the exception of a wife, because she is able to object. Now the Gemara asks, Isha Maishna, why is a wife different than an adult child or Jewish servant? In other words, in total we've had two categories. Now it sounds like we're making three categories, right? In total we said you have on the one hand slave, minor child, and then you had then you have a what's it called? Then you have the Jewish servant, and you have the adult child, and you have the spouse, right? So those would seem to be the two separate cases. But now we're all of a sudden saying just the spouse is the exception. Seems very strange. Yeah, with me? So where it says no, Amarabba Isha b'chol damila. It means a wife and anyone who resembles the wife. Okay, in other words, all those in that category. Really, it's not three categories. It's just two categories. There's just two categories. That there is the adult child, the servant, and the wife. If there's two Eruvin made, if the master or the husband or the father goes ahead and makes an Eruv in one place, and the adult child, the wife, or the servant makes the Eruv in the other, there it does not. There the father's or the spouse does not work. Okay, whereas when it's the minor child or the slave, then the father's does work. Okay. Says the Gemara. The Gemara questions this. Amar mar chutz min ha'isha mnei sheichol limchos. Okay, it said that except for a wife, because she is entitled to object. Taima damachi. The reason that it doesn't work is because she objects, right? In other words, the Brisa seems to say like this. The simple read of the Brisa is that in a situation where a husband goes ahead and sets up an Eruv, right, again, I'm just going to read the words of the Brisa. The Brisa said that in a situation where the father or the husband or the master goes ahead and sets up an Eruv, and then one of these the adult children or the servant or the wife go ahead and set up their own Eruv, they don't go with the masters because of the fact that they actually protested. The implication is because they specifically protested in that situation. Okay, so time and machi. The reason that the husband's Eruv is not binding on the wife is because of the fact that she objected. Okay, hastama nafka b'dabala. But without that, in general, then she does go out with her husband's Eruv. right? In other words, like this. The implication of the end of the brisa is that the reason that the woman does not go out with her husband's eruv, right, is because the fact hadamachi, because the fact that she protested. Implication is if she was just silent, then she would go out with an eruv set up by her husband. Then an adult child would go out with the eruv set up by the father. Right? Again, the Brisa says that when it comes to the adult children, when it comes to the wife, when it comes to the servant, there you don't go with the master / husband / father's eruv because of the fact that there's a protest. Right? The fact that they argued. Implication that if they're silent, then they would go along with that one. Okay? So Haktani Reisha, Elami Daitam. At the same time, the first part of the Brisa said that no, the only way to make an eruv for an adult or for a maidservant and a Jewish manservant, a male or female servant, or for a wife is be with their consent. My love damri in. Consent implies they said yes. So right, you have a contradiction. On the one hand, the first part of the Brisa says they have to say yes. The second part of the brisa implying that if they are silent, right, the only way it's going to work is if they have full-fledged consent. Otherwise, if they're silent, it's not going to be enough. And over here, silence seems to imply that that's going to be sufficient for it to work by the husband. So where it says, "Lo, my elami daitam." What does it mean, mi daitam? Di shtiku, right? That is, they were quiet. In other words, as long as they don't object. Then that is a consent, right? There is a notion in halacha which is called shtika kodza. If you are silent, then you consent, right? If you're sitting in a room, right, and someone says something and you don't disagree, that actually is enough. So the first part of the brisa, when it said that they didn't, that there was consent, it doesn't mean that they said, yes, we need this. It says the husband said, "I made an heir for you," and they're like, "Cool." Right? Or they don't say cool. They don't say anything. That is consent, right? That's enough. And therefore, there is no contradiction. In both situations, as long as they are silent, the shtika kodza, the silence is a consent. La puke hecha da'amri lo. As opposed to a situation where they said no. If they objected, then it's not going to work. But if they are silent, and their father, for the adult children, the spouse, the master for the Jewish male or female servant, in all those situations, if they're silent, that is enough for it to be a consent. In a situation where they say no, obviously it's not going to work. Okay, yeah.
They say no is mainly because they want to go in a different direction.
I'm sorry?
Why would they say no? Because they want to go in a different direction?
Yeah.
Or they don't want to go to lunch with those people? Yeah.
Any reason. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter what the agenda, it doesn't matter what the objective is. It could be they're just in a bad mood. I don't know. It doesn't matter. The point is that as long as they're saying no, then it's going to upend it. Okay, fine. Says the Gemara, Ha v'kulan she'ervu ve'erev alein rabban yotz mishal rabban. Okay, the end of the brisa said that all these situations, if they set up an eruv, meaning the Kanani, the minor child, they set up an eruv, and their master set up an eruv, then they go with the one of their master. Ustamahu. Okay, that's a case where there doesn't seem to be an objection being made, right? In other words, the brisa says a case where let's talk about the minor child. The minor child sets up an eruv over here. The master the father sets up an eruv over here, right? And whose eruv do they go with? They go with the father's eruv, right? Now, there's no mention of a objection in that case. Viktani chutz min isha nafki. Okay, so it sounds like it's a silent case. It sounds like it's silent, and it says with the woman, with the wife, she would not go with her husband's eruv, right? Now, in that case, is there an objection? Again, the last case, the brisa said, father sets up an eruv over here, minor child sets up an eruv over here, then we're going to go ahead with the father's eruv. And in that same case, it says, if it would be a husband and wife, we wouldn't go with the wife would not go with the husband's eruv. Now, over there's no implication that there's any negation. She doesn't speak up. She doesn't say no. We don't hear anyone saying no in that case. It just sounds like a case where he said something up, she said something up, and yet she goes with hers, even though she's quiet in that case. That would seem to be a contradiction. We just said that when she's quiet, the silence is a consent, is a way of endorsement of saying yes. And yet in that case, in the last case, the brisa, where she sets one up and he sets one up, we go with hers, and we don't go with his, even though she is silent. So my answer is very simply, Amarava, Kevan she'ervu en lecha michu gadol mizeh. The case is where she set up her own eruv. There, you don't need her to say no. Her actions speak louder than words. In other words, like this, there's really three different scenarios. There is a situation, a case where a husband sets up an eruv for her, and she says no. Doesn't work. Husband sets up an eruv and she is quiet. It does work because that is a consent. That is saying yes. A situation where a husband sets up an eruv and she goes ahead and sets up her own eruv, she doesn't have to say no in that case. That is the biggest no. I did an action which contradicted your action, and therefore, in that case, also, we don't go with his eruv, we go with her eruv. Okay, good, fine.
That's different for the adult son?
The adult son and wife is going to be the same, right? That's what adult son,
The
what?
father and the adult son.
The,
They just give an example of the father and the adult son, and the adult son went with the father. I might have missed.
no, it was adult. It was a father and a minor son.
Oh, minor son.
Yeah. Okay. 82b3, new Mishnah. Okay, Kamu Shira. What is the shir? What is the quantity for Erev Tchumen? Mazon shtei sudos called echad. Echad is the food for 2 meals for each person who wishes to participate in the Erev, right? So in other words, each person who wants to be part of the Erev, you have to put food for 2 meals. We'll get into more detail about what the measurement for that is. Interesting. Machlokas v'ir mazono lechol v'lo l'Shabbos. Rameir says that the amount is weekday meals and not Shabbos meals. Okay, we'll talk. We'll see what they're what he's talking about in a second. Rabbi Yehuda Omer l'Shabbos v'lechol. Rabbi Yehuda says that we're talking about Shabbos meals, but not weekday meals. Okay, so what they're actually arguing, v'zev miskam l'hakel. Both of them are actually being more lenient. Why are they being more lenient? Okay, so Rameir says that it's the weekday food because typically during the week you have smaller food, right? Smaller meals, right? During the week you have a salad and you're done with lunch. On Shabbos you have salad is the first of 7 courses, right? So Shabbos meals is much more as opposed to the weekday meals, right? So and therefore Rameir, who says wants to be more lenient, is saying weekday food. Rabbi Yehuda, very holy man, he says no. On Shabbos people actually eat smaller dishes. Why? Because they have shalosh shodis. So of course they're not going to eat a big meal. Look at that. She says that on Shabbos, that was an eye roll. Okay. So Rabbi Yehuda says that it's a Shabbos meal. Why? Because on Shabbos we're eating smaller meals because we're making room for the third meal. Bottom line is, they both are referring to a smaller meal. Okay, we're going to get a little mathematical. We're going to save this, unpacking this for tomorrow. But Rabbi Yochanan Baroka says the quantity of bread is a loaf, which is purchased for a punyan, when 4 sa are purchased for a sela. Okay, we're going to get into like all the different costs and markets, whatever. Of tomorrow. That it is 2 parts, meaning 2/3 of a loaf, when there are 3 of them to a kav, 3 loaves to a kav. Okay. Also, we'll see exactly. They're talking about different quantities based on different costs, but we're going to talk about that more tomorrow. Half of this loaf that is discussed above is the food necessary for a house afflicted with tzaras. Meaning, if let's say a person is in the house of tzaras, let's say a house has tzaras. So the person. Let's say a person just is in. There's a house just tzaras, and a person puts their foot in and then runs out, or they go in and they run out. They don't become tameh. Only if they're in the house for enough time to eat a half a loaf of bread. This the half a loaf, meaning the half of the loaf that we just spoke about before, all these the costs. So a half of that loaf of bread, if you're in the house for that amount of time, it's based on a pasuk. If you're in the house to eat enough time to eat half a loaf of bread, that's where you're going to be tameh. If it's less than that, less amount of time, you're not going to be tameh. Okay, so we're going on a tangent over here, and the chati chetz loaf, so it's like via, and if a person eats a quarter of this loaf of bread that was just mentioned, then that is enough to make their body possible. In other words, if let's say there's a loaf of bread that is tameh, and a person eats a quarter of the loaf of bread that was just mentioned above, then they are going to become tameh. Okay, ask the Gemara, according to Mayor of Yehuda, how much food is the 2 meals? In other words, they just said weekday or Shabbos, but how much is it? Rav Yehuda Marav Tarte Rifta Ikariyasa. Rav Yehuda says it's 2 peasants' breads. Okay, that's everyone knows what a peasant bread is back then. Rav Ada Barahava Amar Tarte Rifta Nahar Papesa. It is 2 Nahar Papesa breads. Okay, Amar Rav Yosef braids Rava Avuch Kaman Svirle. Rav Yosef says, Rav Yosef the son of Rava. He says, who does your father Rava? Who does he hold like? 82b4. Karam Meir Svirle. He holds like a Meir, says that a weekday measurement is the right one. And Rav Yossi says, Ananami Krav Meir Svirle. Zikrav Yehuda Kasha Hadar Inshi Rav Chalav Visima Shchiach. Okay, because Rav Meir is correct. Why is it correct? Because there's a famous saying, and that is that a stomach always leaves room for a tasty dish. So what does that mean? If a stomach always leaves room for a tasty dish, then when there's good food, a person eats more, right? When you have good food, you eat more. When it's not such good food, you eat less. Why is that? Okay, it's a psychological thing. But the point is, you see on Shabbos, everyone knows that Shabbos has better food. That's not debated. And therefore, Rabbi Yehuda and Rameir are arguing, which day do you eat bigger meals? Yehuda says, we have smaller meals because of Shalosh Shudas. He says, not true. Because there's good food on the table, because on Shabbos you have good food, people are going to eat more. And therefore, he says, we pass like Rameir, who says that weekday food is going to be, the 2 meals is 2 weekday meals and not 2 Shabbos meals. Okay, we'll stop over here. Have a great